good to know.
However, eighth notes and quarter notes are very scary.
And we should actually touch upon it.
So I can know triplets. Yeah.
Another thing too is that some directors are incredibly sophisticated about music, and you know, sometimes there are composers themselves, or they view themselves as composers.
Oh, yeah.
To what degree do you guys find it useful to have people who come to the table and say, I know nothing about music, I have this movie, I know what I want it to be, but I don't know how to tell you how to get there. Can you throw some ideas forward? Are those a preferable scenario, or is it better to have somebody who's really kind of actively involved at each step of the way of saying, actually, you know what, let's change the key here, or you know, the tempo's kind of off here. Do you have preferences? Mark, you look like you're ready to dive in.
Yeah, I actually prefer the smart guys who come in and say, I know what I know and I know what I don't know, and I don't know anything about music. So I will tell you how to, you know, how it affects the film and what I think, you know, emotionally, but I'll never tell you how to do it. And presumably they've hired you because you know how to do it. I've worked with directors whose their opening line is, I know a lot about music. You know, and that I think is the most dangerous. Because at the end of the day, they don't, of course, and then you have a double job of translating. I mean, it's one thing if a director says, you know, it's just not emotional enough. Well, you can have a discussion about that, right? Is it not sad? Is it not tragic? Is it not fearsome? You know, there's lots of words to describe emotions, and that's a translation job that's not that difficult, especially with lots of experience. But, you know, a director who starts throwing words around, you know, that they actually don't know what they mean, but think they know what they mean, it's rough.
Who do you rely upon in those situations? I know as a music supervisor, a lot of times it's my job to sort of play the navigator between the composer and the director, or sometimes the producers, or frequently the studio people who have their own ideas about it. So, you know, we kind of get stuck in the middle and try to make sure that we're getting the best work out of the composer and are able to articulate, if the director's not articulating well what they're looking for emotionally, give it to the composers in those terms. But I imagine, who are the folks that you guys have found helping to save the day in those circumstances? I'm sure supervisors have done more damage probably in most of your projects than help.
Yeah, no disrespect, but I take that as my primary job.
Yeah, it's just
I can't rely on anybody else. I can give you a list of the films where I've tried to share that responsibility or given the responsibility to someone else, and it's been a disaster every time. Those are the scores I look back and say, oh my God, how did that ever happen? You know.
So, I mean, you've got to be happy yourself with it, or you've got to satisfy it.
And that's why I'm saying the gig really is, you know, social interaction and teamwork. I think more than knowing what note to put after, you know, together. You know, because if you can be Stravinsky, but if you can't get along with Spielberg, you're out of work. I mean, it's that simple.
Did Stravinsky work with Spielberg?
That's why John's got the gig.
I'm curious, as if I may, because it's a great topic, how many of us here, I don't know if there's a percentage that we, you know, but I'm curious, Mark brought up something very interesting, and so did Alex. It is absolutely what we all strive for, is to try to give or impart our vision onto the film. But I'm not, I guess percentage-wise, I'm not always allowed to do that. And that's what Mark's talking about. It's the collaborative, you know, essence of filmmaking. You know, you have to be collaborative. And rightly or wrongly, you may have felt you've written the, you know, we've all felt we've probably written the best piece of music ever written. Rarely in my case. But you know what I'm saying. In other words, we may think it's just perfect, and then everyone comes in, and the director, producers, girlfriends, and they may consider it not so perfect. So it's essential that one has to be a collaborator and develop a thick skin, I think, and just realize that it is programmed music. Whether we're Mozart writing Minuet for the King, you know, we're writing for the medium of film, and our job is to tell the story musically, and that's about it. And past that, if we want to write other types of music, as Mark said so well, there are other things we can write, ballets or symphonies, etc.
Do you find yourself holding back some of your favorite pieces? Like if you have something that you feel so right, but you feel like the timing might be wrong to present it, will you hold it back to the right moment sometimes?
I wonder what everyone else would feel, but I'd say certainly, in general, I always feel that if it gets watered down, it's never as good. However, many times, I've looked back and I've realized, you know what, they were right. Perfect example was Mel Gibson. you know, brilliant filmmaker, brilliant actor, very interesting guy, and
That was a pregnant pause, you realize that?
And I mean it in a good way. I mean, the journey that I had on The Passion was the most fulfilling thing, and the hardest journey. But you know, every step of the way with directors, and I'd love to hear other input. We may be butting heads most of the time, but at the end of the day, I have to give them their due and their right, and that happens a lot. It really does for me.
And sometimes having almost a combative relationship with your director does bring good work out, which is part of, I think, what's exciting about being a film score composer, in the sense that you get to work with different personalities, and maybe find aspects of your own personality kind of coming into play in awkward ways, but you end up doing great work because you're not on your own balance, you're off your feet. Has anyone had an experience where they felt like they were not on a balanced place and were really fishing in the dark, but the work turned out to be really great?
Always. I never consider myself a traditional composer. I mean, I was not schooled in classic film composition. I didn't know how to write for the modern romantic orchestra, or 1927, or whatever the model is, has been for a long time as considered generic film composition. So I was writing a sort of an electronic score for Catherine Bigelow, who was married to Jim Cameron at the time. And I think she took her film home, played it for her husband, and he made some comments about the music. And the next meeting was really interesting, because she ended up screaming at me. It was the only time I've ever had a director scream at me, because I've never allowed it to get to that point ever since. But her line was, "It's just classic film composition," as she left the room, having not liked what I presented. And it forced me, you know, to look at what that meant, and within 48 hours, assimilate stylistically what that meant into what I was writing and represent it. And it was quite an experience, because it was a whole thing. I basically considered that I knew nothing about it. It turns out I actually knew a lot more about it than I thought I did. But it was, you know, a situation I put myself in, a big film that I had to deliver, and I had to confront a whole new genre of music quickly and pull it in. And it was like a roller coaster, you know, ride for me.
I imagine sometimes it's a little bit like going to a foreign country where you know a little bit of the language, and suddenly this reservoir of information comes out as you're talking to people. You didn't even know what's inside of you, but suddenly you're just like, I'm suddenly fluent. How did this happen?
And it was a turning point for me, because all of a sudden I had produced a score, a big action orchestral score, which I'd never done before. And there the resume just opens up. You know, a whole other genre of film has opened up to me to be considered for.
Clint, you've worked obviously with Darren Aronofsky on 3 films. And that's I mean, if you're sleeping in the kitchen cupboard of someone's house, I assume that established a certain intimacy and almost like brothers in war. You've also worked on some other films. Can you compare a little bit sort of that sort of collaborative experience and how the two of you operate versus working with, let's say, somebody who gives you very little time and maybe is much more of a standard studio kind of a format?
Well, I mean, they're chalk and cheese really, because, you know, Darren basically is an artist who isn't really interested in standard filmmaking, in whichever way you want to look at it, structurally, compositionally, whatever, you know. He's not really trying to make the perfect movie that's already been made before, you know. So if you're trying to score one of Darren's films, the approach is going to be very different from if you're, you know, doing an action blockbuster. Not that I've done a lot of those, but, you know, a couple of those type of things. So, you know, the whole thing is completely different, really. But the common thing amongst all of them is the fact that whatever the project is, you've got to spend that time with the director, the producer, whoever, the collaborative people that have been on the film prior to you arriving there. You've got to get in to find out what it is that they're trying to achieve, what they want you to help them achieve, because it is very much a collaborative process, even though you sit on your own and write that music yourself. But it's informed by all these other people that you work with, you know. And that was the thing that I learned early on, because, you know, writing music for yourself in a band, you know, you can just do anything you like. I mean, the only person you're going to make happy is yourself, you know. And if the record company don't like it, that's because they're assholes, you know. Off you go, you know. But when you get into the film thing, I had to learn pretty